Welcome to South-South News. I'm Bill Miller. One of the main goals of South-South News is to focus attention on international issues that impact people not only within countries, but around the world. Today we're going to talk about one of those such issues, and that is climate change. It affects all 7 billion people in the world. My guest is an expert in this area. Her Excellency, Dessima Williams, is currently the permanent representative and ambassador from Grenada. She also chairs the Alliance of Small Island States. Formerly, she was the ambassador from Grenada to the Organization of American States. Ambassador Williams, welcome to South-South News.
Thank you, my pleasure.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into climate change, the Alliance of Small Island States, but let's talk a little bit about Grenada. I know a lot of people, a lot of our viewers have been to Grenada. A lot of them would like to go to Grenada. Tell us a bit about Grenada. How large is it? What are some of your major industries? Where is it located?
It's located close enough for everyone to visit. That's the first thing.
Strategically located.
Strategically located for tourists, volunteers, and investors. That is, it is among the most southern of the Caribbean. You can get there from New York, this direct flight in a little over 4 hours. So it's 90 miles north of Trinidad and just off the coast of Venezuela. So we are fairly south. The next closest apart from Trinidad, it's St. Vincent and then Barbados. So we are in that end of the Caribbean archipelago. The island has been independent for 37 years. It is, has a very mixed economy. Agriculture has receded, but we are basically still known as the Spice Isle because we produce the second largest volume of nutmegs in the world. Our only main competitor is Indonesia. So it's a Spice Isle. It's a tourist hub. We are now very much involved in the ICT information. We also have manufacturing and, as I said, a great tourism sector. Our population is young and vibrant. We do have 3 tertiary level institutions, including the world famous St. George's University, which is now, used to be just a medical school, but it's now a very famous and successful medical school and many other degrees. We are a parliamentary democracy. Our population is English speaking, very ambitious, very energetic. And I think both the tourist and the investor would find in Grenada a very friendly population, a fairly unspoiled territory, and a country that the World Bank has listed as a middle-income country, but we do have our challenges around unemployment and poverty elimination. And that's a big reason why we are involved in a vast array of programs here at the United Nations.
But it's a beautiful area of the world, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will be visiting you in the not too distant future. Let's talk a little bit about the Alliance of Small Island States, the AOSIS. It's a group, I guess, sponsored by the United Nations. What exactly is it? What are some of the regions? How many members do you have? What are some of your goals?
AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, comprises about 43 islands and low-lying territories. So the non-island states are Suriname and Guyana. And other than that, it's about 40 islands in the Pacific, in the Indian and African region, Indian Ocean, and in the Caribbean. So our membership would include Samoa, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, you know, the whole range of Pacific islands, as well as Cape Verde, Mauritius, Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome, Principe, these in the African and Indian Ocean, and then in the Caribbean, Cuba, right through the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad, others. Now, 20 years ago, this alliance was forged because the islands needed more visibility and more voice in the United Nations system. And we have been able to achieve that on perhaps 3 major areas. The first one is in the field of climate change. The second one is in the field of sustainable development. And the third area of our engagement is in a whole series of international cooperation and work and change in the UN. So for example, we propose now for a special seat in the Security Council for small islands. We make sure that in all the different windows, just as we now have an advocacy group of the LDCs, the least developed countries, we have an advocacy understanding in relation to Africa as a continent. We now have an advocacy visibility for the SIDS, we are called the Small Island Developing States. Also in the field of sustainable development, the SIDS had a major conference in Barbados in 1994, and we revisited our agreements in 2005 in Mauritius. So the Barbados Plan of Action and the Mauritius Strategy for Implementation help us achieve development in the field of poverty eradication as islands, education as islands, and so on. And the reason for that is because the islands are, despite our differences, we have one thing in common. We are all uniquely vulnerable to climate change, and we have a very difficult time achieving development because we have a small territory, small base, small economy. We are very open and dependent on the international events and structures and rules. So whether some of them are bigger, such as Cuba or Singapore or Papua New Guinea, but we all are islands. And that brings me to our most important area of cooperation over these last 20 years, and that is in the field of climate change. No matter what the level of development, we have a common vulnerability to climate events. And that is because at least about 65% of all the developments of all the islands are on the coastal regions of the countries. And hurricanes, king waves, typhoons, sea level rise, whatever it is that we are now getting affects all of us. And overnight, in fact, in a few hours, the development, the physical development, the human resources of the countries could be wiped away. And for that, we have this common approach to climate negotiations and climate advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Now, the scientific studies, especially through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was set up by the United Nations, I think back around 1988, they've come up with several scientific studies, 5 in particular that I know of. And of course, there's definite proof that the climate is changing. There's global warming taking place. We see the erratic weather patterns are developing. The oceans are rising, sea levels are rising, desertification is taking place. Have you seen, if we could focus maybe the spotlight on Grenada, have you seen this type of erratic behavior in Grenada? Are there weather patterns changing? Maybe you're not getting the rain the way you did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, but are you seeing that right now?
Well, you've put your finger on one of the most difficult things for us, which is the sea level rise. And that is a result of the warming of the overall planet, but also the warming of the oceans in particular. 90% of the warming that has occurred in the last 50 years have gone into the ocean. And we are surrounded by the ocean. We are not landlocked, we are sea-locked. And as the oceans rise, our shores and our very existence are threatened. And that is the case now of islands such as in Tuvalu, in the Marshall Islands, in Kiribati, in Solomon Islands, in Nauru. They are sinking, and they're losing their agricultural sites. Their cemeteries are being washed into the sea. So there is that threat, even in some of the islands of Grenada, from the rise of the sea level, which is caused by the heating up from this excessive greenhouse gas emissions that have been going on for hundreds of years, principally from the industrialization in the north. Apart from the sea level rise, we are also experiencing, as everybody else in the world, these unusual weather patterns. And I'll give you, since you asked, I'll give you one example of Grenada. Now, our average rainfall in February, which is our dry season, is very low. We get on average about 36 centimeters of rain in the month. In 2010, we had a terrible drought, and we got 0.8 centimeters. That is, we almost got no water. And we had bushfires, we had a water emergency, and so on. 12 months later, we got the exact opposite. Instead of 38 centimeters, we got 136 centimeters of rain in 1 month. So we got floods. Our topsoil was washed away. The blossoms on our peas and our crops were washed out. So, and when that happens, it affects the farming, the income from farming, the roads, the infrastructure, everything. And you would know that prior to that, in 2004, we had a terrific hurricane. Unusual because it came at the end of the season when we normally don't have hurricanes. And that Hurricane Ivan destroyed 204% of our gross domestic product, and it wiped away 80% of all of our infrastructure. Even our parliament is not yet rebuilt. And this is the case for many countries, many island states, experiencing the excessive and unusual patterns in climate change. So we are very concerned about that.
Mm-hmm. And as often has been stated, so often it's, well, of course, it's the industrialized countries that are producing most of the carbon dioxide and that type of thing, but it's often the smaller countries and the least developed countries that suffer the brunt of this with this climate change, because you mentioned 204%, I think, something like that, of your GDP wiped out, and that is just absolutely, it's almost insurmountable to overcome that. And certainly you'd have to really reinvest and hope that things got better in the future. But with the, you mentioned some of the islands. Some of the islands are higher than others. Yes. There's more land mass. I remember a couple of years ago, the president of the Maldives, maybe
yes.
you saw this, put on a scuba gear and took his cabinet yes. down in however many feet of water, meters of water, 5, 10, 15, and conducted a cabinet meeting because that island was basically going to be sinking, as you mentioned, into the sea. How can the countries, especially the small island states, get this message across to not only policymakers at the United Nations, but the heads of government and to the non-governmental organizations and the private sector who really can play a critical role? The private sector can be so involved in this. How can we get the message out to get them more involved?
You're doing your part. You're giving us global airtime, and that's very important because we believe that if the world was aware that the impact of our current patterns of production and lifestyles and how and what we consume, if they were aware that in going ahead with business as usual, that we are actually endangering members of the community of the world, I think people would be willing to change and to protect us and to ensure our survival. So getting the news out is important. Secondly, of course, it requires all of us all together to change business as usual. Now, while the industrial countries continue to be primarily responsible for what has happened, there are new economies that are now engaged in industrialization, and they too have to be responsible. They're called the basic countries, the new ones, my friends in Brazil, in South Africa, in China, India, Indonesia. And in the negotiations, these countries are engaged in taking on commitments consistent with the convention under which we work, so that all together we can change. Even we in the small islands, we are going carbon neutral, we are pursuing the green economy. There is no country in the world who should be doing what it did last year. Everybody must change, particularly around energy. Change the energy grid so that we have a revolution in how we produce and consume. We use renewables, solar energy, wind energy, geothermal energy that does not release gases into the atmosphere. And that is the movement now. That is, and you see the linkage there for us. If we do, the world is engaged in sustainable use of energy, more people can afford it, more people can use it. You save the greenhouse gas and you save the sinking of islands and the polluting of the atmosphere and so on. So I think we are in a very critical and valuable historic period where the islands are, if I could say, we are the canaries in the mine because we, yes, our territory is so flat. We are in Nauru, you can go around the island in half a day. In Marshall Islands, you can see both ends of the island if you stand, you know, off the ground. The lagoon on one side, the wide ocean on the other. These are small places, but people are culturally and historically and economically tied to them. And I think in any case, what we are doing resonates here in New York City. The atmosphere could be improved. So we've got to change and reduce. It's not as if we're saying never use gasoline anymore, but to reduce the percentages in a very organized manner with new technologies. And I see, you know, here in New York, we are going with the electric car and more solar panels and green gardens on the skyscrapers. All these help, and we want to see the whole global movement. Plant more trees, and use less electricity, burn clean energy, use solar.
And everybody has a role to play because
Everyone.
we're all affected by it. And it doesn't matter if it's a small country, a large country, and a developing country, regardless. We all have a role to play, and we're going to have to work on this together or we're not going to be successful. You mentioned New York. A lot of people have said, well, New York is still affected. It's very close to the ocean. It has the East River, the Hudson River. Rising rivers can certainly make this into the Venice of the 22nd century, perhaps. The North American version of Venice anyway. But the point is, it could happen, and we have to take this very seriously, and you're certainly doing that. I'm sorry, you were going to say something? Okay.
Well, I have a lot to say. I mean, a little bit about New York and Amsterdam and these places. You are water threatened. But the thing, for example, in the Netherlands, is that they have vast technological and financial resources that have allowed them to build houses that, you know, they're living in water. Basically, it can be done. And part of what we in the developing countries, we in the island states need is that technology transfer so that we too could get the technological benefits that will allow us to live with water, to adjust, put up sea defenses, to transform our agriculture so it's more water resilient and so on. So there's a big role for the private sector to engage with investments that are needed to mitigate and prevent this kind of release of gases. On the other hand, what has already happened and the damage that is being done, for that we need a lot of public support. And there are billions of dollars that are being used now for one thing or the other, including, if I may say on my own personal account, for military and other purposes or research purposes that could actually be used for research and defense of the islands.
And the military perception is changing. Every country wants a strong military. It doesn't matter who you are, you want to be protected. The citizens want to be protected, but the key is how much do you invest in protecting? And so often a lot of studies show that some countries, the U.S. and a few others, are over-investing in their military, but even the United States Department of Defense has come up with studies saying climate change is a terrible threat. It's not only an environmental threat to people in the United States and around the world, but it can also tie into other types of threats. So it has ramifications, it has other implications that we didn't quite think that way maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yes, I think everyone wants a strong security. And the more we get development, the less would be the threats to our security, and by implication, the less that would have to be spent on military defenses. What we could see is that if climate change is not addressed in a vigorous manner, that we could end up with more insecurity. We could end up with climate refugees, people who have to make alternative arrangements or be forcibly relocated because their countries would either drown or their parts of their countries were drowned. I think we could preempt that. We could preempt that, first of all, by reducing the amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere every day, every year. And every citizen can take action. Imagine if 5 billion persons reduced by 1 to 10% the amount of carbon we released every day, imagine the difference it would make, and it would help to at least guarantee parts of the reversal that is necessary. So part of what I want to say on South-South is that the obligation belongs to all of us in a common but differentiated way. The more you pollute, the more you must stop. But even if you are not doing a lot of pollution, you could do the opposite, which is to reclaim the health of the planet, plant trees, stop sand mining that destroys the coast. But it is to the big multinationals and the big users of fossil fuel that we say, balance out what you do. Introduce, as Norway has, 30–40% of your energy from renewables. And I think that would go a long way towards mitigating the atmosphere. It is an emergency of incredible proportions. And I'd like to invite all our viewers to look up the IPCC report, look up former President Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth. Take a look at it again after you've heard from us as islands. Look at the exponential threat of climate that islands face. And I'm sure that in the academia, in the corporate sector, among communities, in sports domain, everybody could do something to help prevent the disaster that the whole imbalance of the climate could cause.
Exactly. And it's interesting, there are a lot of groups now that are working with other groups to show them what their carbon footprint is, not just corporations or governments, but actually individuals such as you and I. We could look at our carbon footprint, and it's really mind-numbing. We did this. It was mind-numbing to see how many thousands of kilos of carbon that we put out as a family. So it's something we need to do, and we need to focus on it. We're just about out of time. Before I forget it, though, you mentioned former Vice President Al Gore, and one of his favorite terms was tipping point, where you get to that point where we could not really reverse this climate change, global warming situation. Do you think we're getting close to that? Do you think we've gone over the tipping point? I know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that you mentioned, the UN body, has done 5 major studies and a lot of scientific evidence out there. But you're an expert in this area. Are we getting close to the tipping point?
Well, look, I'm not an expert at all. At most,
no, yes, you are.
I want to believe that I'm an advocate for the world to call us back to sanity. We are very fast approaching the tipping point, and as you know, it will be different. It will come at different times for different regions of the world. And we in the islands, we are on the front lines. And for us, I think the tipping point is much closer than it is for the big Himalayan regions and so on. But clearly, the melting of the ice caps, the swelling of the ocean has reached a very critical point. We don't have, according to the United Nations report, what's called the Gap Assessment Report that was released in Cancun a few months ago, we are likely to exceed the limit set. Now, the limit is being set between 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius, as a large number of countries are calling for 1.5, which is where we think we will find a modicum of safety. But the pledges we have are far from that. So the movement towards the tipping point should and must be reversed so that we save those on the front lines and those in the middle and those who are to come. I couldn't agree with you more that the United Nations scientific studies are a great warning, but we know that even they have been a little bit conservative. And recently, just last 2 weeks ago, the American Scientific Research Council, I believe it's called, issued a report commissioned by the Congress, and that report was quite alarming regarding the tipping point. So I would commend it to your viewers.
Well, you're doing some wonderful work with the Alliance of Small Island States, getting the word out, and we would encourage everyone to Google that, go to un.org, go to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whatever it takes to learn more about it, and we all have a vested interest in this. But Her Excellency Ambassador Dessima Williams from Grenada, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Pleasure, and I'm glad you're watching your carbon footprint as I am.
I am. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's South South News.